All right, so I'm very excited to be doing Giorgione today. We have obviously done Giorgione before in the past, drawing from history in previous workshops, but he remains someone I get very excited about talking on because he is very, very important to me personally as an artist. When I first saw one of the paintings that we're going to look at, the Giustiniani portrait, which we're going to see in the next slide. It's one of my favorite paintings in the entire world. It's one of my favorite pieces of art that I've ever seen. And don't Google it before we see it. We're going to see it shortly. I just was filled with this feeling that painting really could be an act of philosophy. I think that Giorgione, above every other artist whose work I've ever seen, demonstrates the capacity of painting to express an inner inquiry, a personal reflection on really simple, everyday feelings. And it's not sort of high abstract philosophy. It's not the sort of high transcendental philosophy of someone like Kant or Plato or Spinoza. Not that you could argue that Spinoza isn't actually arguing for a transcendental view, actually, but with Giorgione, he is using paint in a way which really seeks to express an emotional state beyond the surface of the portrait, deeper than the surface of the paint, or he's trying to make painting actually reflect something more profound than the appearances. I think that with Giorgione as well, the ambiguity of his work, the fact that there is often quite an indistinct or indiscernible narrative at play, opens up so many possibilities and avenues for the imagination, and it excites the interpretive imagination of the mind in a way which other artists don't. There's something so subtle about Giorgione's work. There's something so delicate about his work that makes him quite distinct and unique in the entire history of painting. The problem that we've got is that there are so few works that we can actually say with confidence are by Giorgione. And even those few paintings, you know, 6 to 12 paintings that there is a broad consensus, about them being by Giorgione, even those are contestable and controversial attributions. And so there's very few works that we can say are really by him. And this is a painting that is quite questionable, actually, this self-portrait or possible self-portrait by Giorgione, which we're looking at now. And I think that you would have got some of those ideas that I was speaking of slightly earlier about the emotions. You can see that there's quite a complex expression here. While the head is tilting upwards, he's also got some contortion in the brow, and that gives it that ambiguity, that emotional ambiguity, because one doesn't usually sort of raise their head while frowning. It's more something, we normally tilt our head forward when we frown, and so he introduces two emotions in one dynamic, which is ambiguous. But I think that, even with this painting, we're not entirely sure that it is an actual Giorgione. I think it has a relatively strong claim to be by Giorgione, and it, may have also been cut down as well. But we can see that in this portrait, we have an artist who is really not painting things as you might expect them to. If this is a self-portrait, he's not just painting a likeness of somebody, of himself, and he's not just depicting a narrative or a discernible narrative. Although if this painting has been cut down, it may have had other elements to it which could have alluded to a distinct identity of a person or a distinct narrative. So if this is a self-portrait as David, it could have depicted the head of Goliath. or a sling or something like that. There is some plate armor being worn over the gambeson on the subject, and that hammered carbon steel plate being worn across him is armor, plate armor, so which would have connected him to a chivalric background or a knightly background, a warrior background. Okay, so Giorgione, or Giorgio de Castelfranco. His surname is, well, he doesn't really have, we're not sure about his exact surname, but he's just Giorgio de Castelfranco because he was from Castelfranco. Okay, and before we get into the first slide, I'll just give a bit of an introduction. While we're looking at this painting, which may actually be a picture of him, okay, and I'm sure that you would appreciate a little bit of time to draw this portrait before we get into the next slide, which is one of my favorite paintings ever and one of the most fascinating and ambiguously beautiful, stunning portraits ever painted, in my opinion. So welcome to Silent Poetics in Painting, our new series at Drawing from History on Giorgione. This is part 1, and he is really one of the most fascinating artists of all time. His contribution has had such a profound resonance from the time of his life onwards. And that resonance, the resonance of his work, that sort of deep, resounding impact of his new approach to painting really did open up a new vision of painting, a new vision that was really akin to an ancient idea, actually, about painting, and that is painting as a silent form of poetry. It was Plutarch, the 1st century Greek intellectual scholar and Platonizing thinker, who conceived of painting as silent poetry. He said that painting is silent poetry and poetry is painting that speaks. And it's that link between poetry and the visual, the word, the poetic word, and the poetic speech, which can enrapture the emotions and stimulate the imagination and arouse the feelings. That oral language, that oral art form, or that written art form, was akin to painting, and that painting could possess some of the capabilities of poetry. You know, painting and poetry essentially being two sides of the same coin, or two expressions of the same artistic element, one visual and one verbal. Yet we don't even know if Giorgione ever read Plutarch or had ever thought of it in that way, although we kind of can assume that he did, or we could make an informed assertion that he did consider painting to be a poetic art form. There was lots of discussion at the time about the relationship between the arts, and there's no doubt that Giorgione would have been aware of the relationship between the different arts. But we don't know if he did read Plutarch. We don't know if he explicitly conceived of painting as a silent form of poetry. But he may have arrived at that idea. He may have arrived at something similar to that idea through extrapolation of ideas circulating within the complex firmament of creative and intellectual ideas between intellectuals and artists like Leon Battista Alberti, Leonardo da Vinci, Lorenzo Ghiberti, Giovanni Bellini, who may have been Giorgione's teacher, Albrecht Dürer, and etc. So lots of interesting ideas were being circulated among these artistic figures about the role of dynamics in visual art, about the role of narrative in visual art, and how to convey a narrative with real convincing physical naturalism and perspective, etc. So there was lots of discussion around that related to this idea about poetry being related to painting at the time. Narrative was really important in the Renaissance, and the time that Giorgione was around, painting was really expected to convey a narrative. If it was to be a kind of elite form of painting, to be a genre painting or an historia painting. Dynamics were very important to expressing a narrative because it shows the actions of the body, which convey the machinations of the mind, etc. Leonardo had really emphasized the role of facial expressions in painting and drawing, and the expressions of the body. But the facial expression is something that Leonardo really did explore in his drawings in his time in northern Italy, and that's how, you know, his work would have impacted Giorgione. Giorgione was no doubt aware of Leonardo's work. Everybody was at the time, and his emphasis on facial expressions and the expressing a psychological state through the face was something that was an idea that Leonardo really did advance and did teach a number of pupils in northern Italy, like the Predis brothers, Francesco Melzi, and etc., who did help to disseminate his ideas. Giorgione was also very, very much intertwined with the Venetian development in painting, or the development of Venetian painting, which was very much connected with the two artists we've looked at previously, namely Giovanni Bellini and Andrea Mantegna. And they were all about sculpting with paint, or giving the impression of sculpture with paint, giving that the vitality and form to a subject by enhancing their sculptural relief in painting. Okay, so lots of ideas that are circulating in northern Italy at the time of Giorgione coming of age. He was born in the 1470s, possibly in 1477 or 1478, or maybe slightly earlier or later. We don't have an exact date of birth, but we do know that he died in his 30s in 1510, most probably of the plague in Venice. He was born in Castelfranco but died in Venice of the plague as a young man. And he had enormous influence on his contemporaries and on the future generations of artists that followed in his wake. As I mentioned, he was probably trained by Giovanni Bellini, possibly alongside a slightly younger Titian. Titian would have been about 10 years younger. We don't even know Titian's date of birth. It's sometime around 1488, 1490. But they were certainly closely associated in their careers early on, up until 1510, when Giorgione dies, very, very sadly. And what Bellini had done and what Bellini had achieved as Venice's premier artist, as Venice's #1 painter to the Republic of Venice up until the year of his death, what Bellini had done with getting likenesses of individuals, with achieving a sense of intimacy between the viewer and the subject, in enhancing the figurative naturalism of his paintings, and also drawing from northern artists like Roger van der Weyden and Jan van Eyck. Giorgione really transformed all of those innovations by Bellini and transformed them into an entirely new emotive visual lexicon. And that visual language of Giorgione has never been replicated. It has only been imitated. And we're going to have a lot of fun in this workshop, and the real fun is going to start now, because we're going to look at this. I love it. It's one of my favorite paintings in the entire world. I think that one of the reasons I love it so much is because it is there is such a sense of an actual innocent character there. It does look a little bit like my little cousin, if my little cousin Charlie grew his hair a bit and had a centre part in and that sort of thing. He has the innocent look of my Me and my cousin were very close as children, and still are close. And this really reminds me of the expression he had. And so there is a real personal reason for me to, like this painting, But also, just from an artistic perspective, from detaching from my personal liking for this painting, or personal, uniquely personal reasons for having a sense of connection to this painting. There are other reasons which might still be personal, but are more painterly as opposed to relating to my personal life, so to speak. And that is this very, 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 very engaging yet delicate look. For something to be so engaging and so vivid and yet so delicate and subtle is a stroke of artistic mastery. And I think that at that technical level, that's something that makes it so profoundly admirable for someone like me and you, who are both making visual art. So we draw, we paint, we love art, and this image, this example, it does things that other artists would find tremendously difficult, or simply wouldn't be able to do. They wouldn't. And it's not just about technical facility and skill, it's about taste, delicacy, touch, knowledge, and tact, and sophistication, artistic sophistication, and having a very keen eye. And it's the subtle inclination of the head, the way that we feel that both eyes are really engaging with us, but they have slightly different shapes to them. I mean, that was something that Northern artists had introduced, and Bellini developed on by making us look like we were looking directly at one eye, and the other eye was at a slightly different perspective, and that would make a more dynamic image in an illusionistic way. But I can't be certain that that's something that that's a device that Giorgione has deliberately used here. There are just the visuals of this drawing are so simple yet so dramatically striking that it's difficult to pin. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly what it is. Even the center parting seems to complement, or it does enhance or unify or accent that sense of tilt and inclination because of its alignment with the longitudinal axis of the face, and the way that the left eye is slightly higher than the right eye, which conforms to the inclination of the head and the tilt of the face. The hair, the silhouette of the hair, the shape, just the simple shape of that head is so pleasing. The chiaroscuro is so delicate and subtle, and the way that the light really lifts away from the shadows is so powerful. There are lots of I don't want to go into much technical stuff. I want to discuss the technicalities of Giorgione's approach later on in the series. But one thing I will say now is that Giorgione is painting with quite a new approach to painting, which is far more independent from drawing than what we've seen previously in the history of art. And also the canvas is sealed with a dark ground. There is gesso. There are layers of gesso on the canvas, which is a brilliant white, but it's very, very dilute, which would leave some of the mid ground of the canvas showing through. It wouldn't be a sort of brilliant reflective light like white gessoed ground, which you would have had on a wooden panel where you've done lots and lots of layers, and you would have a very opaque white ground. But the white ground applied to this canvas is much, much thinner. It's a far more dilute gesso, which wouldn't create that brilliant opaque white. It would be a slightly more transparent white, and there would only have been one or two coats of gesso on this canvas, because gesso is brittle, so you wouldn't have built up layer upon layer of it. And so what Giorgione has done is he's painted on this very thin gesso ground, very dilute gesso ground, and it's dilute and thin to preserve its flexibility. And then there is a lot of modeling done in the first preliminary layers of the painting in paint, in dark earth colors, and then the lights have been painted afterwards. Now, traditionally in Italian painting, you would work from light to dark, and the darkest layers would have, the darkest areas would have more of a build up in layers, whereas in this painting, the lights are the most opaque. So he's painted light paint on a dark surface, and that is really making the lights lift off even more. And so the visual effect of, which is concomitant with the approach and technique, has really enhanced a sense of vivacity here. I know I mentioned the word vivacity, and that's connected to the two V's down there at the bottom. Now, Giorgione didn't paint those two V's. The two V's shouldn't really be there. It was someone in the 19th century who restored this painting who put the initials VV there. So they're not by Giorgione. And I said vivid or vivacious. Well, that VV could either stand for virtus vincit, which would be virtue victorious, or it could be virtus vivo, which was the living made me, you know, made after life, or made while living, made by a living artist. So that's what the VV, or they are what the VV could possibly mean or stand for. So I will just go actually down to my notes because I've just been rambling. We don't know the identity of this sitter, although it's called the Castelfrau. We'll often refer to the Giustiniani portrait because the Giustiniani, who were a family in Padua, were the first documented owners of this canvas. And they were not contemporary of Giorgione, so they're the first owners of the. So it's called the Giustiniani portrait. Okay. But it doesn't really have an actual link to the Giustiniani. Oh, no, it's not a portrait of any of them. Okay, I mean, what do we see in the? You know, so we don't really know. This is attributed to Giorgione, but we're not absolutely certain that it's by him. I feel very strongly that it is, as do many others, including eminent scholars in the history of art. I feel very strongly that it is by Giorgione, but we don't know who it is of. It's probably not a self-portrait, but if it's a painting by Giorgione, and if he did paint this in the latter 15th century, then it would have been somebody fairly important, someone of status enough, high enough to be able to commission Giorgione, because Giorgione was already becoming quite famous at this point. He was becoming increasingly sought after in the 1490s, and he painted some important commissions in this period. Now, we can see that he is interacting, this subject is interacting with the parapet. Now, this is something we know. We saw lots of parapets in the previous series on Giovanni Bellini, and so we can discern some continuity with Bellini here in this painting, and yet the subject is actually interacting with it. He's placing his hand on it. Now, there was a painting, a Madonna and Child painting from the 1480s, a decade or so prior to Giorgione making this painting, where we looked at that painting in week 2 or 1 or 2 on Bellini, and the parapet really created a sense of distinction between us and the painted subject. And in the case of the Virgin and Child, that would have been appropriate because we want to keep her in her divine transcendental reality and us in our corporeal and terrestrial reality. There's an important theological and metaphysical difference between her domain and ours. Whereas in a portrait, it's a secular painting, isn't it? So there isn't that metaphysical and theological importance laid upon the subject. But we still do discern a different domain, because they are in a painted world and we are in a physical world. And the parapet distinguishes our space from the space of the subject within the painting, above and beyond the fact that we are physical and they're not. They are two-dimensional. They're not actually a person, it's just an image. But what we do see here is that the subject is placing a hand over the parapet, and that creates a slight blurring of that boundary between our world and his. There's also the gaze, which is so powerful in this painting. The eyes are quite wide, and he's really looking at us in a direct way. And if we look slightly closer, we'll see that a bit more. And I'll give you a chance to work on the portrait a bit more now. You can have a look at, you closer look at the face and look at some of the detail there, and really see more closely the outline of the head and face. And if your image is looking slightly dark, then make sure the brightness on your screen is turned up. You can do that very easily by just turning up the brightness on your screen, and you'll be able to make up more detail and more of the contour. So, I mean, the face is just stunning, isn't it? There is some cracking, but not very much. It's in pretty, you know, superficially from this image. It's not in the worst condition. It's not in perfect condition, but that wouldn't be realistic. So where was my thread? I am talking about the space between us and him, and the gaze breaching that distinction. You know, he's really having a, you know, personally engaging with us at an individual level through that gaze. And that's quite arresting. And we also feel like there is an exchange between us and him, that there is some sort of emotive or conversational discourse going on. This sort of discourse, or this sort of emotional exchange, really begins with Giorgione. If you cast your mind back to the workshops we did on Caravaggio, we did them quite recently, and they are recorded. They're all available to see on YouTube. You can go back to them. When we were looking at the Lombard school and what distinguished Lombard painters from other schools of painting was the importance that the Lombard painters like Moretto de Brescia and Simone Petezzano and etc., they really cared about having an immediate and direct emotional contact with the viewer through their painting. The subjects were supposed to actually engage the viewer in a discourse, in an emotional or conversational dialogue or exchange. And it really begins with this sort of portraiture by Giorgione. And I did mention Giorgione a lot in those classes on the Lombard school when we were looking at Caravaggio and where Caravaggio's ideas came from. Lots of critics not necessarily critics who criticize Caravaggio, but art historians and critics who write and speak about Caravaggio will tell you that Caravaggio was more heavily indebted to Giorgione than any other painter, and I think there's a very strong case to be made for that claim, because so much of what Caravaggio did in engaging the viewer with really visceral expressions, you know, really did begin with Giorgione, and the way of opening up an inner vision of the subject through the expressions on their face in a subtle, delicate way, which was very engaging yet convincing and believable, while being incredibly complex and ambiguous, that was really pioneered by Giorgione. That's why he's one of the most original painters of in the entire history of art. Technically very, very sound as well. Beautiful execution of the painting, really beautiful style of execution, and just an unparalleled and unmatched degree of poetic sensitivity. So yeah, it's really, really one of the top artists ever. So I really hope you're enjoying doing your little portrait of this wonderful little man. He is a youth, really. He's wearing a wonderful violet sort of velvet quilted fabric there. And it's got these beautiful ribbons around the lapel to be tightened. Rich fabric, it's thick, it's, you know, it's typical Renaissance wear. And there's a beautiful white linen shirt underneath. Linen, which the canvas was made of. It wouldn't have been the kind of linen that you would have worn. It would have been a far coarser linen, and yet fine enough to paint a nice portrait on. Beautiful. There's lots of ambiguity here. We get a sense, I get a sense that he's hesitating about something. There's something patient about him. If you think, you'll cast your mind back to just a previous slide where we could see his hand on the parapet. There's something hesitant about his poise, like he's pausing and reflecting or deciding something. Is it a painting about making a decision? Is it a painting about deciding what to say? Is it a painting about that moment in time where you're uncertain about what to do or what to tell somebody? We don't know if he's alone. Is he thinking that to himself, or is he actually looking at us, or are we an illusion? You know, we have a real strong sense that he's looking at us and that he's in an exchange with us, but are we really there in that painted world? Are we really seen in that painted world, or is our sense that he's looking at us purely fantastical? Is he alone in that painted world? Are we not really there? Giorgione is one of these artists that can raise all these questions in a few brushstrokes, and that's why he's one of the best painters of all time, the best artists of all time. So we ought to be moving on now. I'm sure that you want to look at this painting for the rest of your life, as I do, but we're going to have to move on, and we shall. This is amazing. I love this painting. I love paintings that do have a narrative. I love paintings that do tell a story, and I love unpicking the stories in paintings. I was recently in the National Gallery, and I had a really, really joyous experience looking at the Fra Angelico paintings in the National Gallery, and looking at the little objects that told the story and told us who the people were. And we'll look at that painting at one point at Drawing from History. We'll look at Fra Angelico. I can't believe I've never done Fra Angelico, actually. He's one of the most important painters of the Florentine school. But this painting, we can actually really tell a story. We don't know if it is by Giorgione. Some scholars think that some of the figures were painted later by followers of Giorgione. But lots of scholars do think that this really is a painting by Giorgione in its entirety. And the reason I've selected it is because it's another early one. It's another early painting by him, probably by him. It certainly has elements of his style, and I think it's quite convincing. The faces seem to be by him, and we will get a chance to look at the faces. What I just want to do is look at the landscape a little bit, and then we're going to move on and look at a close-up of the figures in the foreground. So don't worry if you can't see much detail there. Don't worry about anything. Relax, have fun, and enjoy the history and the art, and just enjoy drawing and relaxing. So there are lots of beautiful elements here, including these bands. Okay, I can see 1, I can see 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 5 or 6 distinct bands. We've got the sky, we've got the mountains in the background, we've got the landscape in the near foreground, or the far in the or the near background of the castle and the hilltop town. And then we've got slightly closer, we've got some people, two figures there in the just beyond the foreground, close to that water. We've got someone with a shield, and we've got someone with a plough. And then we've got this grassy area with the foliage and the trees. And then we have the foreground, which has got the yellow sanded floor and the figures. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 5 or 6 bands, depending on how you interpret the distinction between each element of the band. So by bands, what I'm talking about are these horizontal parts which comprise the image horizontally. So the sky is like the top section, and then the mountains in the background, and so on. In the very foreground, we have these figures. And this is the trial of Moses. Now, it's very unusual to think of a child, a little baby, being tried. The man on the throne on the left there is the Pharaoh. And we all know the story of Moses being found on the Nile by one of the Pharaoh's daughters. This is taking place in this Giorgione painting in a beautiful landscape with these different bands, which I've made such a big deal about. And there's a beautiful mountain with some buildings on it and a little castle. And so we can see lots of borrowings from Bellini here, situating a narrative in a landscape and really giving a lot of space for the landscape. We see more landscape than anything else, but our eye is drawn down, but it's also drawn up. You know, our eye is really given a lot of stimulation here by both the landscape and the narrative in the foreground. Okay. And now what I'm going to do is focus on that narrative in the foreground and take you closer, and you're going to be amazed at what you see. Wonderful. All right, so we've got this amazing narrative taking place here, beautifully painted in oils on panel. And we have lots of different figures. We've got figures with turbans on their heads. And just think about the interaction between Venice and Byzantium and what became the Ottoman Empire, or what was the Ottoman Empire. It was, you know, the Ottoman Empire was there before Constantinople fell in 1453, but it then encapsulated Constantinople as well after 1453, with the help of cannons designed by a Hungarian engineer, which helped the Ottomans breach the walls of Constantinople. So we've got the connection with the Ottomans and the Byzantines, and you can see that that man with the long beard, it would have normally have been Greeks, and Greeks wearing beards. Artists from the time of Benozzo Gozzoli and Piero della Francesca started depicting Greeks in their paintings in the 1500s, because there were lots of Greeks who were entering into Italy because of what was going on in Anatolia. And lots of Greeks came over, bringing lots of valuable resources with them, Greek texts and their ability to translate them into Latin. So there is a sort of aesthetic is influenced by those events, those historical events going on in the time of Giorgione, or having an impact still in the time of Giorgione. And so that man, you've got these two figures, one holding a pot of gold and one holding a pot of burning hot coals, red hot coals there, which I'll tell you about once we've seen this man. This man here has got this wonderful turban on, and he's got an enormous beard, and he could represent a Greek or a Turk. And I'm not entirely sure, and I'm not sure that anyone could really identify exactly if he's a Greek or an Ottoman Turk. but I would presume probably a Greek, actually, um, because I think that Giorgione would have been more familiar with them in Venice. But I think that you could also, you know, disagree and say, no, I think it could be a Turk, because, you know, we do have wonderful drawings by Gentile Bellini, the slightly older brother of Giovanni Bellini, where he actually went to Constantinople after the fall of Byzantium, after 1453, and visited the court of Mehmet II, the Ottoman emperor, Sultan Mehmet II, and did drawings of Turkish men, Ottoman scribes, etc. And so Giorgione could have been quite familiar with their aesthetic as well. So it speaks of the history of the time. But what about the narrative here? There's so many fascinating things in this painting. I really do love it. There is the pharaoh there, and the pharaoh is a little bit irritated with Moses, but he's also, well, he's a little bit concerned with Moses, actually. He's a bit concerned with Moses. And he's also rather optimistic about him at the same time, or rather trusting of him, because of these two things that happened here. So what happened before this was Moses had the crown of the pharaoh put on his little head, and instead of wearing the crown, Moses, as the baby, picked it up and threw it on the floor. And the scribe, seen there with the beard, looking up at the pharaoh, pointing to the floor where Moses threw the crown, he is saying to the pharaoh, you should execute this baby. You should kill that baby because he threw your crown on the floor, and that means that he's going to overthrow you one day. So the scribe is saying that there was an omen in the baby's action, and the little Moses would actually try to attempt to overthrow, or would overthrow, the pharaoh. But now another little experiment is happening, or a trial is happening. We've had one trial. Now the second trial is underway, and Moses, as a baby, is being presented with two options. He's given a bowl. He's presented with a bowl of golden coins, and he's presented with a bowl of burning hot coals. And he's going to try and pick up and eat one of the burning hot coals, and instead of trying to take the gold coins. And this gives the pharaoh reason to believe that Moses is in fact no threat to him, that he is innocent. He's innocent enough to be more attracted to the burning hot coals than he is to the gold coins. And so he isn't seeking power and position. He's more interested in the redness and the vibrancy of the red hot coals. So that's the narrative that's happening here, and Moses lives and grows to a grand old age, and was possibly had a speech impediment after having cauterized his mouth with a coal. There's somewhere in Exodus mentions that he it's Exodus 4 verse 10, where it was thought to have caused him to speak slowly. He couldn't speak at pace because he'd wounded his mouth as a baby in this trial. And that's in the second book of the Old Testament, Exodus. So there's our narrative, and these are our people here. There's a wonderful gaze, isn't there, on her part? Okay, and she's possibly the daughter of the Pharaoh who found the little Moses in the River Nile. and it's the river above, I presume, which is the Nile. Okay, so we've got people in armor, we've got people in hats, we've got people with long hair, we've got people in hose. The hose are the wool leggings that are worn by men in the early modern period and in the Middle Ages. Got that scribe with the long beard, looks very much like a self-portrait by Titian, painted much later on in the second half of the 16th century. Maybe Titian was familiar with this painting. He would have no doubt seen this painting, and possibly even remembered the scribe or the look of the scribe when he painted himself. When we do a workshop in Titian in the future, we'll look at that wonderful self-portrait and see if it reminds you of this scribe. Wonderful painting, absolutely exquisite. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at something utterly different, and we're going to look at something which quite possibly isn't even painted by Giorgione. Well, this painting possibly isn't painted by Giorgione. It is Giorgione-esque, no doubt, and the Giustiniani portrait might not even be by Giorgione, but it's got a very strong claim to have been by him, as does this painting. But the next one that we're going to look at here is a little early one, and it's attributed to Giorgione with absolutely no certainty. We don't know when it was painted. There hasn't been the close technical analysis of the pigments and the paints, which would present us with an approximate date. But we have a scene which is very much very possibly a very young Giorgione figuring out some of his ideas. And it is so allegorical, isn't it? You know, we don't know if this is Giorgione. If it is, it's an incredibly early one. It quite possibly isn't by Giorgione. It's just attributed to him. Some people think it's by Giorgione, and a lot of people don't. It could be, we don't know. I think that the face, you know, especially the face of the boy or girl playing the lyre there, that really does remind me of some beautiful Giorgione paintings, but you know, it's no way for me to know. There's no way for me to know if it's for Giorgione or not. But my opinion is that it could be, but it, you know, there's no way of knowing. I'll be interested to know what some of you think. But what Giorgione-esque elements are here? You know, if it isn't by Giorgione, it's certainly by someone who was aware of Giorgione and who was, you know, learning to paint and trying to learn to paint in a way that was inspired by Giorgione or was Giorgione-esque. And the fact that this painting is attributed by some to Giorgione is quite a compliment to whoever painted this, if it's not by Giorgione. So we have a sunset. We know that Giorgione was interested in sunsets. That sun is going down, or it could be rising, and the sky is starting to darken. The air is starting to cool. The light is leaving the landscape. There's a bit of reflection in the water. It's very simple composition, just 3 bands horizontally. We've got the sky, the mountains, and then, or 4 if you include the center, the band with the architecture and the water on it as a distinct band. And then we have the foreground with these 2 figures. It's what we would call a pastoral scene, an organic landscape with music being played, elements of Bellini and the bandedness of the, you know, composition and the inclusion of architecture in the landscape and certain details of foliage. This could be a very early painting of by Giorgione when he was still an apprentice, or it could have been somebody much, much later trying to imitate Giorgione. But if it is a Giorgione, then it would have been him when he was very young, learning to paint, possibly still an apprentice, and experimenting with these colors here, building up a few layers of paint on a little wooden panel, a small piece of wood there, given a wooden panel and taught how to prepare it and then execute a painting. It's something that an apprentice could have done in the Renaissance. We have some paintings by Leonardo, which are very early. We know that Leonardo's earliest paintings are probably Leonardo actually helping Verrocchio complete his works, and painting certain elements of his works, like the angel in the baptism and the parts possibly of the landscape of the baptism, and also perhaps the lily in the wonderful Virgin and Child adored by saints, which is in the National Gallery, and the dog in the Tobias and the Angel by Verrocchio. These are all parts that scholars think Leonardo painted in Verrocchio's paintings, but also Leonardo also would have been able to have painted on little panels on his own. There's an Annunciation in Musée du Louvre in Paris, and scholars are beginning to argue that that is not a Lorenzo di Credi, but it's actually a very, very early Leonardo, which he painted independently while still an apprentice to Andrea del Verrocchio. So this could be a painting like that. This could be a very, very early painting by Giorgione when he was still an apprentice or an assistant to Giovanni Bellini, if indeed he really, really was, which is highly, highly probable, but is still speculative because we don't have absolutely irrefutable and conclusive evidence. So, but I think that it really, really could be, and it's, I mean, it's not only the beginnings of an artist learning to paint, but also the beginnings of an artist showing individual ideas that are very much of a Giorgione-esque tilt, with this symbol. It's a bit obvious though that hourglass is the passing of time, and obviously the hourglass is the title of the painting, not that the artist necessarily gave it the title, that's just a title it has been given subsequently. And the hourglass is a symbol of the passing of time. It's a symbol of mortality. It's a symbol of the fleetingness of youth, as is music to an extent, because music is so temporal. It's so transitory. Music is played and then it vanishes. And it was more the case in the Renaissance because they didn't have recording. They didn't have music recording back then. So these symbols of the passing of time, and also the sunset, that cyclic passing of time, that cyclic nature of night and day. So it's the passing of time, it's the fleetingness of music, it's the transience of youth and the inevitability of death. Let's take a little closer look then. And it's so all of these, it's symbolic of all these things, and that symbolism is quite poetic. There's also movement in it and interaction between the figures. It's the older, wiser, bearded sage holding the hourglass, holding it up to the youth who's busy, absorbed in their music. There's a dialogue going on between these two. It's symbolic and it's allegorical. There's a moral to it. There's also an animal, a hare or a little stag, who looks like he's moving very quickly across there towards the older person. Could be, it's not very. It's quite difficult to know where it's intended for us to think of that animal being. Is he intended to be just behind the subjects, or is he intended to be in between them, or is he intended to be further back, or is he intended to be quite close to them? It's not quite possible to really know where that little animal is. but it's certainly moving. We have this real keen sense of movement. So a very mysterious painting, an absolutely a hugely mysterious painting, exceptionally beautiful and also poetic. And even if it isn't by Giorgione, it can still belong in this series, because it just might be a Giorgione, and also it is gives us a glimpse of what Giorgione's earliest paintings may indeed have looked like. Okay, so everybody, thank you so much for joining me today. I really hope you enjoyed our little workshop on Giorgione for part 1, and part 2 will be next week, and we'll look a bit more about his technique and some of his more mature paintings. And part 3 will be looking at his later works leading up to 1510, and I'm sure I'll see you there, and enjoy the workshop again on YouTube if you want to do it again, okay, or spend longer looking at the images to do longer drawings. Thank you very much. Okay, and I'll see you soon.